I think we're going to have a fun conversation about an important new book. Matt Kroenig is an associate professor in the Department of Government in the School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University. He's also a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council. He spent some time at the CIA and in the Office of Secretary of Defense. He's also served as a foreign policy advisor on Mitt Romney's presidential campaign, as well as Marco Rubio's presidential campaign. So he's the author or editor of 6 books, including the one that we're here to discuss this morning, which is The Logic of American Nuclear Strategy, Why Strategic Superiority Matters. That's just recently out this past couple weeks from Oxford University Press. Just for logistical reasons, we don't expect any issues, but for any reason we have to depart the building, just look to me. We'll direct you to the back. There's some stairs back here, but then also, of course, the stairs that you came in. We have to do that for safety reasons, so just, if anything happens, then it won't, but just look to me. So we want to do this really just as a conversation. So this is a new book about nuclear weapons. This is obviously very salient right now. Having said that, I think let me just throw a big question to you, which is, why do we need one more book about nuclear weapons? I mean, there's this nuclear strategy and nuclear theory has been around for a long time. How do you see this fitting into the larger literature, and what kind of purpose is this book trying to serve?
Yeah. Well, first, Tom, thank you very much for hosting this event. Thanks to CSIS, and thanks to all of you for coming out this morning. It's a good question. There's been a lot of writing about nuclear weapons over the past 70 years, a lot of theories of nuclear weapons. The problem is our existing theories aren't very good. We know this kind of second strike theory, mutually assured destruction. Anybody who's taken a course in international relations kind of knows this theory. It says the United States needs the ability to absorb a nuclear attack from an enemy, retain enough surviving warheads to retaliate with the devastating second strike, and once we can do that, nuclear deterrence will hold. The problem is we look out into the real world, and the United States has never been content with just a secure second strike capability. We have thousands of nuclear warheads, missile defenses, counterforce targeting, and capabilities. And so I think that raises an important puzzle, which is why does the United States do what it does? And so scholars have recognized this gap between theory and the real world, and they've said, well, we're going to dismiss the facts essentially and stick with our theories. And in fact, Robert Jervis at Columbia, a leading IR theorist, wrote an entire book called The Illogic of American Nuclear Strategy, which said my theory is right, the real world is wrong. And so I take a different approach and try to explain why the United States has always had this interest in a more robust nuclear posture.
And so what is the theory here? Mm-hmm. I mean, I think you talk about nuclear superiority, but what do you mean by that? And so what is the theoretical contribution that you felt hadn't been done before that is, I guess, important to explain what the United States has been doing, certainly on counterforce and all these other things, but also prospectively how we ought to think about it in the future?
Yeah. So these traditional theories of nuclear deterrence, kind of mutually assured destruction, assume that we target the other side's cities, threaten to kill a lot of people, they threaten to kill a lot of people here, and then neither side wants to fight a nuclear war, and deterrence holds. But the United States hasn't done counter-value targeting in decades. It does counter-force targeting. We plan to use our nuclear weapons to destroy the enemy's nuclear weapons before they can be used, and the purpose of that is damage limitation, to try to limit damage. There's also a moral and legal reason. We don't intentionally target innocent civilians. Other countries do it differently, but we don't do it. But there's a strategic reason as well, which we do that to limit damage to ourselves and to our allies. And that contributes to deterrence. I think it strengthens American resolve, strengthens the resolve of our allies, and ultimately contributes to deterrence. And so kind of the bumper sticker of the argument is scholars going all the way back to Thomas Schelling, who's kind of a leading nuclear deterrence theorist in the 60s, said that nuclear deterrence is kind of like a game of chicken. And so the argument of my book essentially is that if you're one side's driving a Hummer and the other side's driving a Prius, the Prius on average is going to swerve first. And the United States is, another thing that's unique about the United States is we don't just try to deter attacks against ourselves, we try to deter attacks against the entire free world. We have these extended nuclear deterrent commitments to 30 other countries, the 27 members of NATO, Japan, South Korea, Australia. And so essentially, U.S. nuclear strategy is promising to play these games of nuclear chicken, or potentially promising to play these games of nuclear chicken every day on behalf of Estonia against Russia, on behalf of Japan against China, on behalf of South Korea against North Korea. And again, if you're potentially playing games of nuclear chicken every day, you prefer to drive a Hummer, not a Prius.
But of course, the question is whether someone doesn't swerve. Both the Hummer and the Prius are going to end up totaled. And so, the logic of having enough of a threat to the other guy is in the interest of having, no racing at each other in the first place. Mm-hmm. So maybe let me contextualize this a little bit by saying, is what you're putting out there, how does it differ from, I guess, past attempts to think about and getting at strategic stability, which is to say, or just simply put, getting at not having that swerve situation in the first place. How would you differ from all that?
Yeah, well, so I think what our theorists have argued and strategists have argued before is that leaders in the nuclear era face a dilemma. On one hand, they don't want to intentionally fight a nuclear war with a nuclear-armed adversary because the cost would be catastrophic. On the other hand, international politics doesn't end. They still have serious conflicts of interest with other nuclear-armed states. I mean, we see that now with the conflicts, crises between the United States and North Korea, the United States and Russia. And so they don't just want to give in to their adversary because they have nuclear weapons, because they're afraid of nuclear attack. And so the space in the middle is what scholars have called nuclear brinksmanship. Leaders do things to raise the risk of nuclear war, to try to force adversaries to back down. And so we've seen this dozens of times in the nuclear era, and I have a number of case studies in the book. But Cuban Missile Crisis, Sino-Soviet border war, Kargil crisis, again, current crises today. And so one of the questions people have wrestled with is what determines the outcome in these games of chicken? And so previous strategists have said, well, it's all about resolve. It's all about how much do you care about the issue. So they've looked at a situation like the Cuban Missile Crisis and said, well, we just cared more. It was a few miles off the coast of Florida. For the Soviet Union, it was a distant interest. So we cared more. We were willing to run the greater risk of nuclear war. They backed down in the end. And so I agree with almost all of that, but what I add is that nuclear balance of power matters too. And in the Cuban Missile Crisis, go through, and there's just a lot of evidence that leaders on both sides were paying attention to the nuclear balance of power. Secretary of State Dean Rusk said to President Kennedy in the meeting in the XCOM, quote, "We have a substantial nuclear superiority. One thing Mr. Khrushchev may know is that we don't live under the fear of his nuclear weapons to the same extent that he lives under the fear of our nuclear weapons." Maxwell Taylor, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, wrote a memo to Secretary of Defense McNamara saying, quote, "Now is not the time to run scared. We have an advantage in our general war capabilities." General war being a euphemism for nuclear war at the time. So that's essentially the logic of the argument, that leaders do play these games of chicken, and that capabilities matter for that.
Well, let me unpack a couple concepts. I want to really kind of get you to define what you mean by superiority, and then maybe we'll get to the brinksmanship part a little bit more. I think in the book you say that nuclear superiority is a military nuclear advantage over an opponent. Mm-hmm. But that's, of course, pretty broad. I take it you're arguing for the principle that the United States should acquire nuclear superiority, but what does that mean? And is it ever quite so clear-cut? We've come a long way. Russia's come a long way since the days of Dean Rusk. Is it possible that in this sort of bifurcated black and white way that the United States or others would have such stark superiority? So kind of what do you mean by that?
Yeah. Well, I have a chapter in the book where I go through and do kind of nuclear exchange calculations. God forbid if there were a nuclear war between the United States and China, United States and Russia, United States and North Korea, what would it look like? Both if the United States went first with one of these damage-limiting strikes, and what if the adversary goes first and hits us with everything we've got. And so one of the things that becomes very clear is that the nuclear balance of power matters quite a bit for what that outcome looks like. So the United States does likely today have a first strike capability against North Korea if we were willing to go first and try to limit blunt North Korea's nuclear capabilities to the greatest extent possible and protect ourselves with missile defenses. I think it's unlikely that North Korea would be able to get nuclear weapons to the United States. With China, we likely do not have a first strike capability with China, but there we do have significant damage limitation capabilities. If there were a nuclear war between the United States and China, it's clear that it would turn out much worse for China than
Such as?
for us.
So maybe walk through that. What kind of damage limitation things are you talking about when you discuss that?
Yeah. Well, I should say too, again, this is about the logic of American nuclear strategy, and so this is what the United States military, the Department of Defense, has thought about for decades: counterforce nuclear targeting, using our weapons to destroy theirs. And so, if you look at China's arsenal, it has some fixed ICBMs and fixed silos. So those are fairly easy military targets. They're stationary targets. China has tried to go to sea. It's been interested in developing a submarine-launched ballistic missile capability for some time. This is one of the ways the United States ensures the survivability of its arsenal. But China's struggled to do that. It's still not doing regular deterrence patrols. So one of the other ways that China has tried to guarantee its survivability is by going to these mobile missiles. And so they have mobile missiles, but the United States likely could or may try to track and target those missiles in the event of a nuclear exchange. So we may not be able to get everything, but we could get a lot. And this is something that the Chinese and the Russians are worried about. They're worried that we have a first strike capability, that we destroy most of their nuclear forces in a first strike and then use our missile defenses to mop up the rest. And so that's what I mean by damage limitation and by superiority. Can we reduce the damage to ourselves and to our allies? And God forbid, if there's a nuclear war, does it look worse for the enemy than it does for us?
So are you, in this theory, are you basically endorsing kind of a first strike capability, or at least approximating it to the extent possible as a goal of U.S. policy?
Well, I think one of the things I'm arguing against is often in Washington or in these theoretical debates about nuclear deterrence, people say, well, the goal is mutually assured destruction, the goal is mutual vulnerability, that will lead to stability. And I think there are cases where, the United States and Russia at the height of the Cold War, where we really had no choice. We were both vulnerable. Even there, though, both sides were looking for advantage. The United States looked for qualitative advantage, even though there were quantitative warhead caps. But there would have been very hard. But I think what I'm pointing out is that that's not the goal. That's maybe a unfortunate, second best outcome. But the goal really is and has been and should be superiority. I mean, the superiority we had over Japan at the end of World War II, for example. Thank God we had that. Thank God they didn't have a survivable nuclear force. Thank God we have nuclear superiority over Iran, North Korea. Do we really think we would be better off if they had survivable nuclear forces that could reach the United States if we were in a situation of mutual vulnerability? So maybe it's an obvious point at some level, but I think many people start thinking about nuclear deterrence and often go to this mutually assured destruction model when really the goal should be superiority. Now, in some cases, it may be impossible to get or difficult to get, and so there are countervailing conditions. But we're better off if we have an advantage over our adversaries.
Right. So let me now move to the other part of the thesis, and that's brinksmanship. Whether, I guess, the United States or someone else is in your category is superior, what are you suggesting about the importance of engaging in brinksmanship, or of not backing down in brinksmanship, and what are the risks as well for that kind of recipe?
Yeah. Well, so games of nuclear chicken are dangerous. We saw that in the Cuban Missile Crisis. John Kennedy said the risk of nuclear war was somewhere between 1/3 and 1/2. Cargill crisis. We've come close to nuclear exchange all the time, but again, leaders face these gut-wrenching decisions. On one hand, they don't want to run a risk of nuclear war. On the other hand, they don't just want to give their adversary a free pass. So they play these games of nuclear brinkmanship reluctantly. And I'd argue that this brinksmanship framework, I think, is a good way of understanding what we've been doing with North Korea over the past 6 months, and some other more recent crises as well. But the basic thesis of the argument is that in these games of chicken, the superior state is going to be, well, the inferior state is going to be more likely to swerve and less likely to play in the first place. Why play a game of nuclear chicken if you're going to lose? And so I have a lot of evidence in the book. I'll go through a lot of these case studies, but also some quantitative evidence. And one piece of quantitative evidence I think really stands out. So some colleagues of mine, Todd Sexer at the University of Virginia, Matt Furman at Texas A&M, have a good book from a year or so ago out with Cambridge University Press, and they argue that nuclear weapons don't matter for international coercion. And so they collect a quantitative data set of what they say is every military compellant threat issued in international politics from 1918 to the present, and they look at the success rates of nuclear-armed states when they issue these threats, and they compare that to the success rate of non-nuclear states when they issue these threats. And they say, well, the success rate is about 20%. About 20% of the time when they issue these threats, the adversary gets in, so that gives in. So they say the success rate is the same, therefore, nuclear weapons don't seem to matter. So I was interested in this because it's contrary to what I was arguing, so I dug into the data a little bit. And essentially what they have is a lot of cases of non-nuclear states threatening non-nuclear states since 1918. And so that's not really what I was interested in. So I said, well, let's look at the cases of nuclear states threatening nuclear states. So according to their data, nuclear states have issued these kind of threats 49 times since 1945. Guess how many of those threats were against countries with fewer nuclear weapons? And guess how many of those were against countries with more nuclear weapons, according to their data? 49 to 0. According to their data, never in the history of the world has a nuclear-armed state with fewer nuclear weapons threatened a nuclear-armed state with more nuclear weapons. So I think that's pretty compelling evidence that, again, the inferior state prefers not to even play these games of nuclear chicken.
But are there, and I don't know the data set, but are there meaningful cases of interactions between the U.S., Russia, and China that would, in a way, kind of more significantly inform the question of stability between the major nuclear powers, or these smaller things? In other words, how applicable is that?
Yeah. Well, so a broader point for a DC audience is, this book really does try to bridge the gap between kind of academic theories of deterrence and kind of real-world nuclear strategy and policy. So I'm trying to engage in several debates at once. But so on the more academic side, there's kind of a question: how do you get evidence about the real world? How do we know if our theories are right or not? A decade or so ago, there were big debates of, is quantitative analysis better? Is qualitative analysis better? And I think the conventional wisdom now is that you really need both. This isn't physics, it's social science, it's fuzzy. The data is not great, and so the more pieces of evidence you can get pointing in a certain direction, the more confidence you have that you're onto something. And so in the book, I do have the quantitative evidence, but I do have the qualitative case studies looking at some high-stakes crises between the United States and Russia. So I look at the Cuban Missile Crisis. I look at the 1973 Arab-Israeli War, where the Soviet Union threatened to intervene. The United States, Henry Kissinger, made some nuclear threats, put our nuclear weapons on high alert. In the end, the Soviet Union decided not to intervene. Look at the Sino-Soviet border war. In 1969, the Soviet Union and China came very close to war. And there you, again, see a lot of support for this idea that the nuclear superior state gets its way. The nuclear superior state's more willing to kind of run the risk of nuclear war, to force the other state to back down. And leaders in both states are paying attention to the nuclear balance of power and arguing that it matters. And so again, for the kind of conventional wisdom, mutually assured destruction, if nuclear superiority doesn't matter, then why are our leaders, why are Maxwell Taylor and Dean Rusk talking about it? Well, theorists who have looked at this before have said, well, they were wrong. They shouldn't have paid attention to this. They don't get our theories. And so as a rhetorical defense, maybe that works, but if you want to understand the world as it actually played out, if you want to understand the cases as they developed, I think you have to look at what the leaders themselves said mattered.
So, listening to this, it occurs to me that I think the recommendation to continually pursue superiority to the extent possible, is this kind of a way of responding to a kind of, maybe not merely intellectual, but also kind of programmatic laziness about an overconfidence about, frankly, the security of our second strike, and perhaps an overconfidence about, or underconfidence rather, about the willingness of other folks to play the brinksmanship game better than we do. And so I'm thinking, for instance, about the nuclear posture review. And you seem to be suggesting that in order for our ultimate guarantee to be secure, we have to be constantly attentive to the little details to make sure that it is in fact secure. But there's always this kind of perpetual disavowing in Washington about pursuing a warfighting capability, and the nuclear posture review does that too. Mm-hmm. Do you have a thought on that? Should we perhaps be talking about the credible warfighting capability in a positive way, as opposed to apologizing that we would never pursue that? What's your take on that?
Well, so when it comes to nuclear deterrence and nuclear strategy, for whatever reason, you're right, people have this dichotomy between, is it a deterrence strategy or is it a warfighting strategy? And I reject that dichotomy. I mean, in no other area of life do we think that deterring something is fundamentally divorced from what happens if deterrence fails. So if you think about bars on windows, the point is to deter crime. But it's also to physically stop the crime if necessary, if it takes place. And I think nuclear deterrence theory is no different. If you're trying to deter an adversary from challenging you and your interest and your allies, then that's fundamentally related to what happens if they do challenge you and what is the next step. And so, the purpose, of course, is to deter the war, to not have to fight the nuclear war. But in order to do that, you have to look just over the step and say, well, what happens if deterrence does fail? What comes next? So I see these things as fundamentally linked, not somehow different spheres.
You talk about this in your book, but I mean, right at the very beginning of the nuclear age, Bernard Brodie says that the purpose of our military establishments from now on is not to fight wars, but to prevent them. Is your take on this different? Is Brodie wrong?
No, I think he's right that the purpose is to prevent nuclear war. The question is how best to do that. And I think a minimum deterrent, because if the United States were content with just a minimum deterrent or a secure second strike, we could have a few dozen nuclear weapons on submarines, and that would probably do it. But again, the United States has never been interested in that. And there is a bipartisan consensus on this. I talk in the book, John Kennedy in 1963 was the first to say that the United States needs a nuclear arsenal, quote, second to none. Hillary Clinton, when she was Secretary of State in 2010, said the United States will be, quote, stronger than everybody else, as we've always been, with way more nuclear weapons than are needed many times over. And Trump last year said the United States will have a nuclear arsenal, quote, top of the pack. So again, we have this puzzle. Why have U.S. leaders been so interested in superiority when the theories say they shouldn't be? And my answer is these theories are, not that Brodie's wrong, but they're incomplete. They really do need to take into account the nuclear balance of power in a way that they haven't in the past.
Now, you mentioned missile defense a couple times. I guess I would point out that where we are in that field is so dramatically under where we might need to be to have any meaningful impact on the calculations of a Russia or a China. I know it's mentioned a little bit in the book, but what's your view of how active defenses, or for that matter, passive defenses, can contribute to our security and to the calculus of others, I guess, in this brinksmanship theory?
Well, the central argument of the book is really centers around damage limitation, that the United States' willingness and resolve to defend allies, to defend our interests, depends on our vulnerability to nuclear war. And so the more we can limit that vulnerability to ourselves, the more we can limit our adversary vulnerability, the firmer we're going to stand in these conflicts of interest with other nuclear armed states. And so that raises the question then, what are the ways you can limit damage to yourself and your allies? And the answer is offense and defense. So part of it is offense, having the nuclear capabilities to conduct counterforce strikes and blunt your adversary's capability, which again is something the United States has always, or at least for decades, been interested in. But the second part is defenses. Whatever survives from the adversary's force, you want to be able to protect yourself and to protect your allies. So yeah, you know, in sports you've got to play offense and defense. I think in nuclear strategy you have to play offense and defense.
And yet, of course, I mean, this is in the preamble of the ABM Treaty from 1972 said, you know, recognizing or on the assumption that the defenses for strategic weapons would contribute, you know, to instability. Mm-hmm. So, wouldn't this be a recipe for strategic instability? Wouldn't this recommendation be a recipe for an arms race if we were to pursue that more actively?
Well, I'm glad you asked. So the first part of the book talks about the possible advantages of these nuclear advantages. So it lays out the argument, talks about the advantages for warfighting, for coercion, for deterrence, for extended deterrence. But an argument that's been made by those in the kind of mutually assured destruction school is not only that nuclear superiority doesn't matter, but that pursuing it has real risks. It undermines stability, it leads to arms races, it causes nuclear proliferation, it's just too expensive, we can't afford a robust nuclear posture. So the second half of the book then looks at these possible costs of a large nuclear arsenal. So I have a chapter on stability, arms races, non-proliferation, the defense budget. And what I show in those chapters is that there are costs in some cases, but that they're often exaggerated by these kind of opponents of U.S. nuclear strategy, and often they're even non-existent. So again, looking at on balance, it makes sense that the United States has done what it's done. There are advantages to having this robust nuclear posture, and the costs are either non-existent or reasonable. You know, because again, if there were costs to doing what we're doing, then again, you know, U.S. nuclear strategy is illogical. That we've been doing crazy stuff for decades. We should have just followed the academic theorists' advice, and I was skeptical of that, and you know, so show in the book why the United States can pursue this robust nuclear posture without incurring major cost in terms of stability, arms races, et cetera.
So, I mean, a lot of the conversation over the past 6 weeks has been around the modest supplements that the new NPR recommends. But, you know, as you look at this from a little bit more theoretical perspective, but also with familiarity with the policy, what are some other things that we ought to be thinking about as a country to get at the superiority that you're recommending? And I'm going to lead you a little bit with this, with the suggestion that what are the counterforce capabilities that we ought to be thinking about, in a perhaps a less reluctant manner that would get us to where you want us to go?
Yeah. Well, I think we're already starting to think about some of those things. You know, so one possibility would be these hypersonic glide vehicles, which the United States, Russia, and China are pursuing. Another would be a modernized ICBM. You know, one of the things that's kind of strange about U.S. nuclear posture now is that our SLBMs are actually more accurate than our ICBMs, just because the SLBMs the submarine launched ballistic missiles were modernized at the end of the Cold War. We didn't get around to modernizing. The ICBMs are a little bit older.
But the particular mission or utility of those things would be what?
Well, the more accurate a missile is, then the better it can be used for counterforce targeting. You know, if you're trying to destroy a hardened ballistic missile silo, the more accurate the strike, the more likely you are to kill that target. So accuracy contributes to counterforce, and so the United States is and will continue, I think, to take steps to increase the accuracy of its defenses. You know, another thing is that conducting a counterforce strike, again from the United States, because we care about international law, we care about moral and legal concerns. We don't want to target population centers. We don't want a lot of collateral damage. So I think the move to lower yield warheads is another thing, combined with accuracy, that will allow the United States to destroy an enemy's nuclear forces without killing large amounts of people.
And where does escalation control fit into this? And maybe that kind of builds on the last thing you said. But it's not merely about the academic calculations of, as you said, general war, but it's the smaller stuff that really seems to be the attention right now. And so, how do you see nuclear superiority or military posture broadly, or declaratory policy, fitting into, frankly, within a crisis, getting someone to back down, communicating resolve, all that kind of thing, and frankly, just de-escalating a situation.
Right. Well, so again, the argument is that the country in the inferior position is going to be more likely to back down, and I think show a lot of evidence for that in the book, that that's exactly the way it plays out in the crisis, that it's the country that's outgunned that's looking for off-ramps. And this is something a little bit contrary to the way some other people in town or nuclear theorists talk about it, because you raise the stability concern. One argument that people make is, well, if the United States has kind of superiority, if we have counterforce targeting, if we have missile defenses, then the country that's outgunned is going to feel use them or lose them pressures. Maybe North Korea, rather than wait to have its nuclear arsenal wiped out, is going to use nuclear weapons early in a conflict. And so I go through the logic of the argument in the book, but at a superficial level, that kind of use them or lose them argument makes sense. But at a more fundamental level, it really doesn't. You are essentially arguing that North Korea is going to choose to intentionally launch a nuclear war against the United States to ward off the nuclear war it's afraid of. The United States, yes, might have a first strike capability against North Korea, but it also has a second strike. So that would be a way for Kim Jong-un to essentially guarantee the end of his country, the end of his regime. So these use them or lose them arguments, I think logically, don't really make much sense. And if you look at the evidence, again, a lot of the evidence in the book that the inferior state backs down, not that it intentionally launches a nuclear war, is looking to escalate the crisis. So I think that's how it leads to escalation control. If you have a superior nuclear posture, you convince the adversary that it's not worth running the risk of nuclear war.
So just to open up to a discussion from the audience here, but just in very simple terms, the concepts of deterrence and defense and defeat. It kind of sounds like what you're suggesting is that superiority requires that more attention on defeat capability and more attention on defense can contribute to deterrence of an inferior power.
Exactly.
Assuming that everybody's clear on who's inferior and who's not.
Yeah.
Is that right?
That's exactly right. And this may sound controversial or provocative given the way we usually think about nuclear deterrence, the way it's taught in the classroom. But again, if you
not your classroom, I hope.
Well, I teach all sides of the debate. But if you look at the way nuclear strategy is actually done, again, we don't do mutually assured destruction. We've always been interested in damage limitation. The new nuclear posture review lays out damage limitation as one of the roles of U.S. nuclear weapons. Going all the way back to Jimmy Carter, Secretary of Defense Harold Brown said, we've always considered it important to target the forces that could do damage to us and our allies in the event of nuclear war. So again, on one hand, I think the argument's controversial because it's very different from our usual models. On the other hand, it explains the real world. This is the way the United States thinks about nuclear deterrence.
Good. Well, why don't we open up for some questions about the book or about more current policy issues? And wait for the microphone if you can. This gentleman right here. Wait for the microphone. And if you could just give your name and affiliation. And then
Mike Vasetic, PBS Online News Hour. I haven't read the book yet, but congratulations on all the great blurbs. I want to burrow a bit more into the cost issue, because with the Soviet Union, there was never a question that they were going to be richer than we are. China is potentially richer than we are, and they also hold trillions of dollars of our debt. How is that going to factor in?
Well, thank you very much for coming, Mike. Great to see you. So I have a chapter in the book on the cost of building a nuclear posture, and then also on arms races, because that's an argument that people will often make, that the United States shouldn't pursue superiority because it'll just lead to arms races. Russia, China, others will try to get similar capabilities to close the gap. So first on cost, the United States is modernizing its nuclear arsenal over the next 30 years. The Congressional Budget Office estimates that this will cost about $1.3 trillion. So some people have looked at that number and said this is just unaffordable. But if you actually put it in context, this comes to, depending on the year, 5 to 7% of the Department of Defense budget. So is 5 to 7% of the defense budget too much to spend on nuclear weapons? I guess reasonable people can disagree, but Secretary of Defense Mattis has said this is the most important mission of the Department of Defense. So if it's the most important mission of the Department of Defense, 5 to 7% seems quite reasonable, maybe even good value to me. On the arms race part, it's interesting. The United States and Russia, I think, have been at rough parity since the mid to late 1970s. You look at our other nuclear-armed adversaries, China and North Korea, the United States has always had a clear superiority. So focusing on China, which you mentioned, I think there are a number of reasons for that. One, I think China's economy has been booming over the past several decades, but that wasn't always the case. And so I think part of it was financial restrictions that prevented China from building a superpower type arsenal. Second, I think, is Chinese thinking about nuclear deterrence. Mao Zedong and Deng Xiaoping did have kind of a mutually assured destruction model in mind. They said once you've got a few nuclear weapons, that's essentially enough to deter any adversary. And so China today says what they're aiming for is a, quote, lean and effective nuclear deterrent. I talked to my Chinese colleagues, and U.S. Experts and officials for some time have been afraid that China was going to try to sprint to parity, to try to build a nuclear arsenal to match ours. My Chinese colleagues continually say they have no interest in doing that, which I think is good news for us and our allies. But the final thing is I think China's also had some organizational problems that's prevented them from developing a robust nuclear arsenal. So I think part of the reason they haven't done deterrence patrols, I'm told, is that they don't fully trust sending nuclear weapons to sea with their military commanders. That for a long time China has had its nuclear weapons stored in kind of central depots, and the idea was that in the event of a nuclear conflict, then they'd have to get the warheads out and get them out onto the missiles and the submarines and other things. It's difficult to do what the United States has done over the past several decades with its nuclear posture. It's difficult to build this type of superpower posture, and I think that's part of the reason why China and North Korea haven't done that.
I think we had up here in the front as well, and then over here next.
Thanks. Eric Hirschhorn. I'm a senior advisor here at CSIS, although non-resident. To follow up on the cost issue, I think it was, you spoke about President Kennedy. I think his father called him during the primaries in 1960 and said, "What are all these bills? I'm not paying for a landslide." The question is whether we are paying for a landslide, not just a Hummer, but a Hummer with, but a stretch Hummer with a bar and a floor show and what have you, and how much that, in fact, takes away from troops on the ground. Because every action since 1945 has been a non-nuclear one. There have been a lot of them, and you can only spend $1 once.
Yeah. No, it's a good question. So, kind of a related argument that some people would make is that we actually use our conventional weapons. We haven't used nuclear weapons, and so let's put our money into the more usable conventional weapons that can affect things on the battlefield. And I would actually argue we use both every day. I think we use nuclear weapons every day. So Paul Nitze, who is a nuclear strategist in the Cold War, used the analogy of a chessboard. And he said, in a game of chess, you may never use the queen, but she still can have a decisive influence on the game because she can help a pawn advance. The fact that she could be used is affecting where the other guy moves and doesn't move. And I think nuclear weapons are the same, that even if they're not used, their shadow hangs over any conflict involving the United States and its adversaries. And so I think it has contributed to deterrence over the past 70 years. So in short, I think both are important. And so then you get into a question of what is the relative importance and where should the resources be devoted. So again, I think maybe reasonable people could disagree and say 5 to 7% is too much, but maybe we can have the argument after. But I think it's a reasonable price. 96% of the budget is going to other things. 5 to 7% for nuclear, I think, is reasonable.
All right, I think we got this gentleman here, and then we'll go up here.
Srujan Hande, Johns Hopkins. I want to start off by saying that the Nuclear Posture Review correctly stated that times have changed and that it's no more the days even 10 years ago or during the Cold War, and we need to face these threats first and foremost. So I thank you for your book of taking that attitude and moving ahead with it in a positive light. But I want to go more in particular with superiority and what the Nuclear Posture Review has recommended, particularly with the sea-launched cruise missiles. And will that actually give superiority in sense of particularly dealing with China? Because the Pacific Ocean is a lot bigger than the Atlantic Ocean, to be frank. And on the other hand, is the confidence on the SLCMs overblown, or is it realistic? Thank you.
Great. Well, so as some of you might know, the Nuclear Posture Review came out a couple of weeks ago. One of the more controversial elements was the call to create 2 supplemental nuclear capabilities. So the Obama administration put in place a plan to modernize the U.S. nuclear arsenal over the course of the next 30 years. The Trump administration endorsed that, and then, in addition, suggested 2 supplemental capabilities. So a submarine-launched cruise missile, and then a low-yield submarine-launched ballistic missile. And so some have said this is controversial, it lowers the threshold of nuclear war, et cetera. The reason I think those capabilities were recommended is because of Russia's nuclear strategy today, which is quite frightening. So Russia has this concept of de-escalatory nuclear strikes. So basically the idea is if we get into a war with Russia, and especially if they're losing, rather than lose, Russia might use 1 or 2 or a small number of nuclear weapons on the assumption that Western leaders aren't going to be willing to run a risk of nuclear war over Estonia. So they can pop off a couple of nukes and we're going to back down. And I think there are a number of reasons Putin may think he can get away with that, but I think part of it is a gap in capabilities, that he has a lot of tactical battlefield nuclear capabilities, low-yield nuclear weapons that could be used on the battlefield. And we really don't. And so what I see these 2 new supplements doing is filling that gap to some degree, giving the United States a low-yield capability, not because we want to use it, but the opposite, to deter Putin, to convince him from going down this path in the first place. And of course, the submarine-launched cruise missile is not an unrealistic capability. The United States had it during the Cold War. We actually had it up through 2010 when President Obama decided to retire it. And so essentially this is kind of resurrecting capability we've had in the past. And the Russians have a similar capability. So it's not going to lead to some kind of arms race. The Russia already has a lot of nuclear weapons in this space. In terms of how it fits into the theory, I think that these limited nuclear strikes are essentially another way of kind of raising the risk in these games of nuclear brinkmanship. The Russian strategy is not that using 1 or 2 nuclear weapons is going to be so devastating they win the war, but rather it's a signal that there could be more to come. Essentially asking Western leaders, do you really want to run the risk that things could spin out of control? And I do think that the United States has an interest in defending our allies in NATO, defending our allies in Eastern Europe, and so we need to have a serious defense strategy for that. And so we need to be able to have a response kind of on the escalation ladder to Russia if we're going to continue to play that game of nuclear brinkmanship. And so I think that's what those new capabilities provide us.
Let me interject here, because I think this might be a really good moment to ask how your endorsement of superiority maps to the actions of Russia. Is it the case that all these innovative things that Putin's doing is trying to get a kind of superiority and a kind of an ability to get us to back down? So in a way, Putin seems to be following this theory perhaps better than we are. But then let me also say, to what extent does your theory really map to the new recommendations of the NPR? Because, and I think you kind of alluded to this, it's not so much about getting superiority to defeat Russia in a war, as much as it is to get a few more things, a few more options to, frankly, communicate our resolve and the credibility of our resolve in responding to that kind of a scenario. So that's sort of the 2 parts question. How well does your endorsement map to kind of what Putin's doing and getting a kind of superiority and getting us to back down and getting us to swerve in a NATO kind of environment? And then how, are we actually pursuing superiority, or are we actually just trying to improve our resolve and communicate our resolve in this way?
Yeah. So I think I think the Russians have often thought about nuclear weapons in a more similar way as the way, to the United States, and they haven't had the same kind of theories of mutual vulnerability. We now know that Soviet plans during the Cold War called for kind of an immediate use of nuclear weapons in Europe, So in the United States, I think that at least the theorist and the strategist have had this kind of distinction between conventional warfare operates according to a certain logic and nuclear warfare operates according to a different logic. And I think that they're more similar than we often imagined. And I think we don't need to tell Putin that. I think he thinks of these as usable weapons. In terms of how the recommendations of the NPR match on to the argument, and this is kind of what I was trying to say before, but these games of nuclear brinksmanship, again, leaders don't want to fight nuclear wars, but they don't want to back down, and so the space in the middle are these games of nuclear chicken. But if you want to keep pressing the pedal in the game of chicken, going at your adversary, then you have to have gas in the tank. You have to have the ability to keep going. So you don't want big gaps in the escalation ladder. So this is something Henry Kissinger recognized early in the Cold War. Kissinger feared that the United States would face a choice between, quote, suicide or surrender, that we'd have a choice of either backing down or of fighting a full-scale nuclear war, and he argued we need to have these options in between. And I think that's what these new supplements in the NPR do. They provide these supplements in between to prevent us from choosing between suicide or surrender, so that we can, if Russia invades the Baltic, if Russia uses nuclear weapons to try to defend its position, that we can keep kind of escalating the crisis without going to a full-scale nuclear exchange, which would be catastrophic.
Okay, great. Right here and then right here.
Peter Rogers, retired corporate executive, interest in military affairs. How do we factor NATO into the practical reality of our nuclear defense posture today?
So it's a good question. So I think part of the reason the United States has been interested in this robust nuclear posture for decades is because of extended deterrence. If the United States decided tomorrow we're going to pull back, we're going to have a more isolationist foreign policy, our nuclear weapons are only to deter attacks against ourselves, then I think we could get away with a kind of minimum nuclear deterrent. I think we could have a posture that looks more like China's. But we ask a lot more of our nuclear weapons than any other country on Earth. We ask our nuclear weapons to defend attacks on the entire free world. So as I kind of said before, we're promising to play a potential game of nuclear chicken, today, if Russia decides to challenge us on behalf of Estonia, on behalf of Latvia. And so I think that's part of the reason we have this large, robust nuclear force is to credibly extend deterrence to allies in Europe. The other way the allies come in, though, is we have these nuclear sharing arrangements in NATO. So in addition to America's strategic forces, we have 200 or so gravity bombs forward deployed on territory of NATO allies. Some of the NATO allies have dual capable aircraft, so aircraft that can be used to deliver either conventional or nuclear weapons. So the idea would be that if we got into a major war with Russia, and this was the policy during the Cold War too, that the allies could deliver these forward deployed nuclear weapons. And so there were a number of purposes of that. One, it was thought to increase the credibility of deterrence, to make the Russians understand that it's not just the US president who might decide to use nuclear weapons, but maybe the European allies have some independent ability to deliver US nuclear weapons. But also there's an important burden sharing component that the NATO allies are participating in the nuclear mission. And so I think that will likely continue going forward. The allies now are in the early stages of acquiring new dual-capable aircraft to replace the kind of aging F-15s and F-16s and Tornadoes and other things. Where this gets interesting, though, is that will the United States decide to do something similar in Asia? So during the Cold War, we also had nuclear weapons forward deployed in South Korea. We took them out in the early 1990s. With the North Korean nuclear threat heating up, the debate in South Korea is changing. And many South Korean experts and some leaders are saying the United States needs to return its forward deployed nuclear weapons to Korean territory, and if not, that South Korea will consider building an independent nuclear deterrent. So my own view is that right now there are some things we can do to increase the credibility of extended deterrence in Asia, short of forward deploying nuclear weapons there. But I suspect this is an issue that's not going to go away anytime soon, especially if North Korea's nuclear and missile program continues to advance.
Right here.
Hi, Mark Bucknam with the National War College. I find your argument that nuclear superiority leads to stability makes sense, but only if the nuclear superior power is a status quo power and not a revisionist power. There have been some articles lately about the potential for Russia to build up to over 8,000 nuclear warheads, and I don't see any signs that the US is looking to do that. So let's just project forward and say, what if Russia remains sort of a revisionist power and builds up an arsenal that size? What are the implications for your theory, and what should the US response be?
Yeah, it's a great point. You know, it's a book about the logic of American nuclear strategy. So when I was talking about the stability part, it was, what if the United States has the first strike capability? Is that destabilizing or not? And my argument is essentially that it's not. But I think you're right. If the shoe was on the other foot, if Russia, China, or North Korea had kind of clear strategic superiority over the United States or allies, given their revisionist goals, I suspect that they would try to use that for offensive purposes. And I think to some degree, that's what we see in Russian strategy today. They're using their tactical nuclear advantage for these coercive purposes, making explicit nuclear threats during the crisis in Ukraine and other things. So I think it's important that the United States continue to maintain at least strategic parity, if not superiority over Russia. And I share some of your concerns. Right now, due to the New START treaty, we're locked in at parity with no more than 1,550 strategic deployed warheads. By the way, for people who don't follow this closely, the peak for the United States was 1967. We had 31,255 nuclear warheads. So we've come down quite a bit. The New START treaty has us locked in at 1,550 each. But what if the New START treaty is not extended? What if Russia decides to cheat on the New START treaty like it's done with a lot of its other arms control agreements? What if they decide to rapidly expand their nuclear capabilities? My assessment is that their infrastructure wasn't really shut down at the end of the Cold War. They've just kept going. We saw that with Putin's announcements last week with these new nuclear capabilities. So I worry about that, and I think the United States does need to be prepared. Let's hope, in my view anyway, I think the New START treaty is in our interest. But we have to be prepared for what happens if Russia decides it's no longer in its interest, it pulls out and ramps up its nuclear capability. And I'm afraid right now that our infrastructure has deteriorated to some degree, and that needs to be a priority. The new nuclear posture review recognizes it as such, and so I hope the resources are there to do something about it.
Well, let me, I think, close out with this one, and that kind of builds on the question of numbers. Let me go back again to your definition of nuclear superiority as having a nuclear military advantage over someone else. And yet, as I'm listening to this, and I'm thinking especially in terms of the NPR here, I wonder if there isn't an element rather of not of the military superiority, but of the kind of the political superiority, and a superiority in terms of resolve. And especially given the emphasis that you put on brinksmanship, because you can have the stretch Hummer, with all the bells and whistles, but if the person driving the stretch Hummer doesn't really believe in it, and furthermore thinks that the guy in the Prius is just nuts, that Hummer might swerve. And so in a way, doesn't it ultimately come down to resolve, which is, Herman Kahn said, the best way to look willing is to be willing. Mm-hmm. And isn't so much of our conversation today about trying to kind of reinvigorate the serious thinking about the no kidding technical capability to use these things in response to some other aggression, say by Russia?
Yes. So at the end of the day, I think what matters is resolve. How resolved are we to defend our interests, to defend our allies? How resolved are enemies toward challenging that? And so the question is, what contributes to resolve? And so these traditional theories, mutually assured destruction, kind of second strike theory, did recognize that countries would play games of nuclear chicken But they said the crash is bad for both sides, so the capabilities don't matter. What matters is your stakes. You know, how much do you care about whatever it is you're fighting over? That's all that matters. So what I'm arguing is they're right, stakes matter, but it's not all that matters. That capabilities matter too, and capabilities affect resolve. I mean, after all, I'd be more resolute in a game of chicken if I were driving the Hummer than the Prius. I don't know about you, but I think most of us would be. And the stakes underlying the crisis are not something that the United States can easily control. And to some degree, one characteristic of extended deterrence is arguably the stakes always favor our adversary, at least arguably. I mean, I think Russia has a story it can tell itself about why it cares more about Estonia than Washington does. I think China has a story it can tell itself about why it cares more about East Asia than Washington does. Kim Jong-un can tell himself a story about why he cares more about South Korea than the United States does. And so if we're always operating from an arguable stakes deficit, then we have this capabilities surfeit to make up for that. And to some degree, that's the logic of American nuclear strategy.
Good. Well, I think we're going to leave it there. Thank you, Matt. I'm sure we're going to have a lot more conversations about this, and please join me in congratulating him on his new book. So, cheers.